Blessings to you. I bring you greetings from Roosevelt, Honduras, where they would greet by saying, Buenos dias, Dios les bendiga a todos. Or they might say, Titanyamni in Mosquito, Dawanyamni Maimumbia. Those are along with English, are the three languages that make up the sphere of our daily life in Honduras. And so I'm going to share with you a little bit about what life there is like, a little bit about the ministry that we get to be a part of, and the things that we see God doing. Okay? There we go. And with the time that we have, I might go a little bit over on this hour, if that's okay, and then have a little bit shorter message. That'll fit my material a little better. So, so we live in Honduras. We've lived in Honduras for about 5 years now, and I want to tell you a little bit about what that's like. It's a multicultural presentation, if you will. I want to take you into the life of the people among whom we live and explain a little bit about what their mindset is like, how they think, how they live, and what some of the challenges are, and then a little bit about what we're trying to do to address those needs and shine the light of the gospel in that part of the world. As Sean pointed out, there are quite a few of you who remember us from a little bit of time that we spent with you at Crosspoint, which for us was an incredibly formational time in our life. We moved to this area. We were very young, had a couple of young children, and really had no idea what we were doing. And we found among you all a family, a place to belong, a place to be welcomed. And we still feel that when we come back here. We don't get to see you very often, but you all have a very special place in our hearts. You mean a lot to us, and your friendship is precious to us. And so it's a privilege for us to come back and share fellowship with you. We consider you as kind of long-distance family. And so thank you for welcoming us back, for giving us this space to come and share. Our oldest two children were very small when we lived here, and then Elsie, our youngest, was born after we left. So lots has changed on that front. But God has been faithful. So I want to tell you a little bit about what we're doing, but I want to make it clear that what I'm telling you is it's not a story about us. It's not a story about the Hoblet family. It's a little bit about the Mosquito people and the life that they live, but most importantly, it's a story about God and what God is doing in that part of the world. And that's the lens through which I think we have to look at everything. This is a very familiar passage of Scripture. I know all of us know it, out of the first chapter of Colossians, and I'll just read it. It's speaking of Christ, and it says, He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by Him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through Him and for Him. Again, this is a passage of Scripture we all know very well, and it teaches a principle that sometimes we call the preeminence of Christ. This idea that Christ is first and He is above all. It is Christ the Lord above all. That's the concept that we see in these verses. In fact, that whole first chapter of Colossians really deals at length with that idea that Christ is before all and above all. And I think myself, as Christians, this is kind of the most basic concept. This is the beginning of everything that we believe, is it not? This idea that Jesus is first, that Jesus is Lord. And I think as Christians, if we miss this point, then we've missed kind of the whole message. And I would take it a step further to say that if this point isn't driving the way that we live, then possibly we've missed the message. That our lives need to reflect this message, that Christ is Lord and He is above all. And that has to be the baseline. And if it's not, then maybe we're missing the point. And so I'm here this morning to tell you that for us, for Crystal and I, this is our call. This is why we go to Honduras, and it's why you all live here and do ministry here in the communities in which you live as well. So the place of the world that God has called us to carry that message is the eastern tip of the country of Honduras. This map is a map of the entire country, divided up into its 18 departments. And the one at the far east that's shaded red is the area of Honduras that's known as La Mosquitia. It's called La Mosquitia because it's where the Mosquito people live. And in fact, La Mosquitia is not just in Honduras, it also includes the entire eastern coastline of Nicaragua, which is the next country to the south. So that whole area, only the Honduran portion is shaded here, but all of that coastline is La Mosquitia. And that's where the Mosquito people live. The Mosquito people are an indigenous people group who have lived in that part of the world longer than anyone else. They are, because of the geography of where they live and cultural factors and other things, they're a very isolated people group. For example, the Honduran portion, this isn't necessarily true of all of the Nicaraguan portion of La Mosquitia, but the Honduran portion of La Mosquitia is not connected by road with the rest of the country. So if we go back to the map, the area you see in red, the border between the red and the white, there aren't any roads that cross that border. So you can't drive back and forth. So the only way to get people and goods out to that part of the country is either by boat or by airplane. The reasons for that are many, but some of it has to do with the terrain. There are many, many miles of very rugged mountains. They're not the biggest mountains, but they're just very rugged, and they're very sparsely populated. They're very dense forests, and it's very hard land to cross. Interestingly, when the Spaniards came and colonized Central America, the Mosquito people were a people group that were never reached by the Spaniards. They were never colonized by the Spaniards. The Spaniards came and universally colonized all of Central America and parts of South America and established a kind of common base of Spanish Catholic culture, which still permeates their culture to this day. That's the basis for a lot of their culture. Among the Mosquito, that's not the case. The Mosquito have never had that Spanish foundation, and so they have just a different perspective, a different culture than the rest of their country. And so there's this line of separation between La Mosquitia and the rest of the country that's not just geographic. There's a cultural division. There's a linguistic division. The Mosquito people speak their own indigenous language. That's their first language. Spanish for them is a second language, and many of them don't speak it. So there's a language and cultural barrier. And as a result of all of this isolation over many generations, there's a very deep prejudice against the Mosquito people from most of the rest of the country. And to be fair, that prejudice goes both ways. The Mosquito people also tend to look unfavorably on the rest of the Hispanic culture as well. So there's a lot of different ways in which this isolation plays out. And so what it does is it creates a style of living that is just very difficult. They're isolated from infrastructure and services that the government might provide, like roads and schools and hospitals and other things that people expect their government to provide for them. They're out kind of in the middle of the jungle, and they're left alone, and nobody really bothers them. But at the same time, nobody really helps them either. Here's a couple of pictures of so what I've shared with you so far is kind of the big picture, right? The 30,000-foot view. And so I want to zoom way in to the other extreme and look at one individual and his life, just to kind of give you a little bit of a perspective on what their life looks like. This is a friend of mine who lives in our village. His name is Laston, and he's a little younger than I am, grew up in Nicaragua, and came up to our village as a young man. We live very close to the border with Nicaragua. We're down about 5 miles from the border, so we have a lot of people from Nicaragua that come through. And he moved to Nicaragua. He and his he found a girl in our community, and they have one little girl. They live in a little house that he built when they got together, which is the house on top. That top picture on the top left was the house that they originally lived in. And it's a fairly typical method of construction. The houses they build are from locally harvested wood that they cut themselves. And in this case, it was on a dirt floor with a thatch roof and then an exterior kitchen. And that's the way that they lived for several years. Incidentally, this picture is taken, you can see there's a glow in the background through the trees. And that glow is not a sunset, that's a fire. It's a wildfire, which is very prevalent in our area during the dry season of April. Everything is tinderbox dry, and they use a lot of fire in their agricultural processes. They don't care well for their fires, and they get out of hand and turn into wildland fires. And so on this particular day, there was a fire that had almost completely surrounded this house. Well, 180 degrees. It had come almost all the way around. Their house is sort of out on the edge of the village, and they weren't there. They had been traveling. They were in another village visiting family or something, and so they weren't home. And when the fires come, it's a pretty difficult thing to put them out because there aren't fire trucks and water pumps and things like that. So it's rakes and shovels and trying to beat the fire out, which is pretty difficult. So there was some significant concern that they were going to lose their house, and thank the Lord they didn't that day. The fire went out before it came up the hill. But they almost lost their house. You can see in that picture, off to the right of that house, is the beginning of a timber frame structure. And that structure was what later became their new house, which is pictured down below. And so this is a little bit more typical construction method. They very often build their houses up on posts. Mosquito people traditionally live along rivers and swamps, and so a lot of water. So they build their houses up on stilts. And so Laston worked very, very hard to build this house. He did a lot of work for us to get a little bit of money to buy the nails and the tin and the hardware and things like that. And he worked over a period of a couple of years. He worked mostly by himself with hand tools to build this house, and he did it with his own sweat, blood, and tears. And this picture I took one day. We went to his house to have a little Bible study, and I was the first one to get there, and I climbed the stairs, and I get up there, and he's sitting there laying on his hammock. You can just barely see him laying on the hammock there on the front porch of the house that he had just finished building with his own hands. And it was just a really neat moment for me to see that, because I knew how hard he had been working. And he had been coming to us asking for help and borrowing tools and looking for work and different things. And so he had worked very, very hard to build that house, and now it was finally done. He did it all himself. He made the doors, he made the furniture, everything. And so that was a really fun moment for me to see that. And it's just a little bit of an insight. For him, he has no work. There is no income. There's no industry in that area. And so if they need money for something, it's kind of just scrounging around trying to find something somewhere that they can get a little bit of income from. Here is a picture of him sharpening my axe with a little file. He was digging out a stump for me as we were building some fence along our garden. And so it's those kinds of odd jobs that's kind of their only source of income, and there aren't very many people around to give them that work. And so it's a subsistence living. They plant their rice and their beans and their plantains and their yucca, and that's pretty much what they live by. They live to farm and farm to live, and there's not really much more to their life than that. It's really hard for me to encapsulate the culture and the mindset in their life in this little bit of time that I have here with you this morning. I wish that I could take you on a walk through our village, and you could see all of the houses, and you could see their rice fields, and you could see their plantations. But also, if we did that, you would also see children with no school to go to. You would see families that are broken and dismantled and dysfunctional. You would see people without a lot to eat. You would see a lot of evidence of people with nothing to do, which is harmful in all kinds of ways. And so it's not all great. I decided that the best way that I could think of to try to show to you the way that a Mosquito person thinks is to give you 3 examples of sayings that they have in their culture. And we have them in our culture too, right? The things that we just say without thinking, the idioms that just come out of our mouth that we're so used to that we don't even think about them. They're just kind of a part of our living. And so there are three sayings that the Mosquito people use. We hear them all the time, the people around us, that I think kind of help to illustrate or identify the way that they think, the way that they approach life. The first one is "somos pobres." It means we're poor. We're just poor. And we hear this all the time. We have people who come to us asking for help, or they need something, or they have a suggestion about something we might do to help the community. And very often, these words, or at least the idea that they carry, will be present in that request or that conversation. It's something that people say a lot, and it's not just. It's true in a sense. If you look at their life and you measure what they have, their material possessions, they don't have a lot. None of them have a bank account, and if they did, there wouldn't be much in it. Their houses are very simple, very basic. Their way of living is very down to earth. So it's true in some ways of looking at it that they're poor, but often this expression becomes kind of an out, kind of an excuse sometimes, or an obstacle. They view it as it's part of who they are, and it's more than just a condition that they're in right now. It's an identity. It's who we are. We are poor people. That's our role in the world. That's our job is just to be poor. And so it's really pretty destructive, and it's very limiting. It prevents them from accomplishing things that they're capable of doing. Another thing that we hear people say quite frequently, and in fact, part of how they identify themselves as a people is somos olvidados. We're forgotten. Nobody cares about us. Nobody remembers us, and our lives really aren't that important. And again, there is some basis for this belief because in a lot of ways they have been forgotten. The Honduran government really doesn't care about the Mosquito people. Honduran government as a whole it lacks the resources to do what it ought to do, what it needs to do. And so, unfortunately, La Mosquitia is a pretty easy place to just kind of forget about. And so there's a lot of things there that are left undone. The health system is badly understaffed and under-equipped. The schools are almost non-functional. The school in our village, technically there's a teacher assigned there, but the teacher almost never shows up. And then a couple years later, they'll assign a new teacher, and that teacher will come for a few weeks and then just kind of go on permanent vacation. There's really no accountability. There's no one, holding their feet to the fire to make them do their job. And so the kids just kind of go without an education. And so there are a lot of things like that, a lot of examples of how, in one sense, they kind of are forgotten. But again, the problem is that they don't just see that as a condition that they're living under. They see that as an identity. That's who we are. We are a people that are destined to be forgotten. And then they begin to internalize it, that we're forgotten because we're not important, because we don't matter. And then ultimately they project that onto God. If everybody in the world has forgotten about us, then I guess God has also forgotten about us. So it's a very deep part of their internal processing of the world. The third thing, and this is one that's just a very common expression. We hear it all the time, ¿Qué vamos a hacer? Which just means, it means what can we do? They use it in a similar sense in which we would maybe say it is what it is. We hear that a lot. Well, it is what it is. What are you going to do about it? And there are times when this is a healthy attitude to have. There are times when we don't do well to worry and fret about things that we can't change. But there are also times when there is an answer to this question, that there is something we can do. But it's not usually used in that sense. It's almost always used in the sense of throwing up our hands and, what are we going to do about it? I don't know if any of that, if that resonates with you, if you can understand, but hopefully that gives you a little bit of a picture of the mindset and mentality of the people that we work with. They're not unintelligent, and they're not lazy. They're intelligent, hardworking people, but they're deeply, deeply affected by this cultural identity that they are at the end of the chain, at the end of the road, and there's no hope. And it affects everything that they do. And it creates a lot of problems in their families and in their churches and in their personal lives. And so there's an enormous opportunity there for ministry. I really appreciated Joe's opening, speaking of Christ's compassion, because Jesus came from heaven to earth to seal the terms of our redemption. Right? That was his purpose, was to come and die, and with his blood seal the covenant. But the way in which he ministered was to show compassion. So there's a direct link between our salvation and the gospel and God's compassion. It's not hard to see that link. I mean, the fact that we're saved is based on the compassion of God, right? God had compassion for us as sinners. But beyond that, when Christ came to die for that salvation, He lived for however many years, Scholars say 33 years was how old he was. And he spent that time having compassion for people's needs. And so there's a model that we see in Christ of how we should live out the gospel by living a life of compassion, just like Joe taught us. And that fits so well into what I'm sharing this morning, because that really is the model that we seek to follow. I don't know how familiar when we lived here in this area, we were actually part of MMS Aviation down in Coshocton, and it's been since then that we've transitioned to Missionary Air Group, which is who we now serve with. So I'll just give a quick rundown of what Missionary Air Group is. We're a very small organization. We don't have missionaries all over the world, but our mission statement, if you will, is to use airplanes as a means of delivering things that people need, like medical care and humanitarian aid and ministry teams and things like that, to people who live in places that are really hard to get to, and for the purpose of, with the intent of showing the compassion of Jesus, following his example, and showing God's love, showing God's compassion. We believe that compassion is a bridge that you build over which a credible gospel can travel. And so we want to give the gospel credibility. And in order to do that, we have to present the gospel the way God presented the gospel, which was first with compassion. In our Honduras program, we have basically 3 areas of operation. The first is the aeromedical program, which is using the airplane to primarily to fly patients and doctors and medical teams. But there are other things we do with that as well. We have the Roosevelt Hospital, which is actually just a small clinic. It's called the Roosevelt Hospital for historical reasons, but it's a clinic that's in the village where we live that we operate. And then we have pastoral training and education and evangelism programs as well. So those are kind of the 3 areas in which we work in Honduras. I'll give you a little bit of detail about what that looks like. In a place where there are no roads, and within La Mosquitia itself, there are some communities that are connected by roads, and they're pretty rough roads, but there are some roads. We have a truck in the village where we live, and we can use that truck to drive out to the coast, and that's where we can pick up groceries and things. But there are many communities that have no roads at all, and the communities that do have roads, they only go between those communities that are in that area. None of them go into the city. And so for a family who lives in there, their main means of transportation is with a canoe or a boat of some kind, or maybe hitching a ride on somebody else's truck. Almost all the vehicles are owned by people who are not Mosquitos, people either North Americans or some of the other Hispanics that have moved into the area and maybe have cattle farms or something. And so transportation is very difficult. That's the point that I'm getting to. Some people live. We visited a community earlier this year. Their nearest hospital was in Puerto Lempira, and it's probably 6 hours on a boat. Their boat's about this wide and 20 or 30 feet long with a little outboard motor, going up through the mangroves and the canals, and it's a 6-hour ride. And it's not a very good option for someone who's really seriously sick. And we asked the doctor in that community, what do you do when someone, when you have a real emergency? And they said, well, we send them on the boat. And so we said, well, what if what if they can't travel that way? Well, then they wait here and maybe they get better. And that's all there was. That's just it. And so it's really a difficult situation. This little boy, his name is Marvin. He lives in a community about an hour and a half north of where we live. And they're farmers. They live off the land, and his dad has some cattle. And so there's not a lot of help available, and so his dad needed some help, and so he stuck Marvin on a horse, and they were out together rounding up cattle. And he was at that time, I don't know, maybe 5 years old, up on a horse rounding cattle. And of course he fell off, broke his arm. And I'm pretty sure that there are several of us here who have had children with broken bones. That's not all that abnormal. If you've raised very many children, you've probably had broken bones in your house. We've had a couple of them. And so I think that's something probably that's fairly familiar to us. But I seriously doubt if any of you have ever thought, this could ruin my child's life. Because for us, it's an inconvenience, a little expensive maybe. It's hard to see your children in pain, but we know that there's resolution for that. A broken bone isn't really all that severe. But in this context, you can't take that for granted. I've seen people in the city who have arms that are loose, limp, and just hanging, and have been that way for years because they broke a bone and it just never got fixed. And now they can't work, they can't live a productive life, and they're probably in constant pain. In Marvin's community, the only way to live is to raise your own food. And they almost all of their farming, the farm equipment that they have, the farm machinery that they have, is a machete. And that's it. So if you can't do it with a machete, then it doesn't get done. And so if his right arm was broken, he couldn't swing a machete. And they would have been very little hope for him to have a meaningful life. And so we spent a good deal of time, one of our teammates spent a good deal of time coordinating to try to find a hospital and a doctor, and to find somebody that had the pins that they needed. And none of that is just available. You have to really fight to find all of that and coordinate it. The public hospitals often have a weeks-long waiting list, even for something like a broken bone. We know of someone who had a broken femur and waited, I think it was 3 or 4 weeks that she waited before she finally got into surgery with a broken femur. And so it's really a difficult circumstance to be in. But we were able to find a right doctor who had mercy, and a hospital that was willing to let him come and do the operation, and somebody who had the hardware, put all that together. And then ultimately, with the airplane, we were able to take him and his dad, fly him to the city. And he got the surgery that he needed. And this was probably a year and a half ago. And so I've seen him since then, and he's perfectly normal. His arm is whole. He runs around like a normal little boy, and he'll have a fairly normal life. And so it's just one little example of the ways in which the conditions in which they live, their isolation, create a lot of difficulty. It's a difficult life anyway, but then when something goes wrong, it can become just impossible. As I mentioned, the airplane is also useful for other things. This picture on the top left is a group of men who come down from North Carolina a couple of times a year, and they go out along the Patuca River, which is north of us, and there's a whole series of towns, villages up that river that they go to, and help pastors, support churches, just develop the churches in that area. It's a group of pastors who come down and do that work. They're not part of our organization, but they need to get out to the same area where we're working, and it's a difficult place to get to, and so we're able to use our airplane to help other ministries carry out their work as well. That picture there on the bottom, those are pizza boxes. It's exactly what it looks like. We also use the airplane to bring in critical supplies. This picture was taken, I think it was earlier this year after a big medical event that we had in the hospital. And everyone was tired, and nobody wanted to cook food, and there's no restaurants out where we are. And so I was taking the last team of doctors to the city to drop them off. And very often when we go to the city, we'll have a list of supplies to bring home, groceries that aren't available out there, and building supplies and things that we can't find. And on this particular day, the only thing on my list was just bring us pizza. And so that's what I did. So we don't make special runs just for pizza, but there are a lot of things that we fly in from the city, things that we need to keep our operation going and keep our people healthy, and so we're able to use the airplane when we have flights to bring in supplies, medications, and things that we need in our village. The second area in which we work is the Roosters Hospital, which is the clinic that we have in our village. It's a small kind of first-line clinic. We have one Honduran nurse that works full-time. We see probably 150 patients a month. And then several times a year, we'll bring in teams of doctors or dentists. And we'll have our big event is in February, and we'll have 800 or more patients that'll walk to the clinic for the week to be seen by a doctor. For many of them, it's the only chance that they get to see a doctor. And so they come, many of them walk a day or more to get there, and they come speaking, many of them only speak Mosquito. And so it's a pretty big effort to cover all of their needs. We try to do that a couple of times throughout the year. And so we have kind of surges of patients that come through our clinic. And there's a phenomenal opportunity for ministry there too, because we have people coming from a long way away, people that we don't normally interact with. They're coming to our village, usually staying overnight while they're waiting for a doctor, standing around waiting, just kind of there. So it's a phenomenal opportunity to interact with people and have some positive impact on their life. The third area that we focus on is training and evangelism. The pastors there are a lot of churches through La Mosquitia. It's not really classified. It wouldn't be correct to classify them as unreached people because they have a lot of churches. The problem is there's very little depth to their biblical knowledge and spiritual life. The pastors who lead these churches are pastors who grew up with very little access to education of any kind, and certainly not much in the way of Bible education. And they've never really been shown or taught how to study the Bible, how to understand it, how to preach it, how to lead. And so there's a very serious drought of good biblical knowledge and leadership in the churches. And so that's an enormous area for opportunity for ministry. We do some children's ministry, vacation Bible schools. We help a little bit with Sunday school and some of the local churches now and then. And this is an area that we're really wanting to grow into. The longer we're there, we've lived in this village now for 3 years, and the longer that we're there, the more we are seeing how so many of the problems that plague them, including the spiritual problems, come from a lack of knowledge or a wrong mindset. And so there's so much work that can be done to show them a better way. Teach them what the Bible says. Not very long ago, we had a marriage conference in our village. We live in a community where nobody gets married. They just don't. And part of it is because it's difficult to get the legal paperwork that they need to do it. But the bigger problem is that their culture has a very throwaway mindset towards relationships. And so they just don't last. And they don't ever really intend them to last. And they have very little concept of what the Bible teaches about God's design for family. And so there's an enormous stronghold there in their culture. And it's something that we've wanted to tackle for a long time. And we had the opportunity this year to have our first marriage conference. We hope it's the first of many. We went through the book Love and Respect. Some of you might be familiar with that. And just tried to show them and teach them a little bit about what God says about what your relationship is supposed to be. And the idea that marriage is designed to reflect the gospel, to reflect God's love. Nobody's ever told them that. And so how can we expect them to live a biblical marriage if no one's ever told them? And so that's kind of that education piece. Education and training is something that we really want to grow in as we look towards what are the sustainable ways to have a long-term impact and not just give out rice, So that's kind of the summary of the work that we're doing. We're a little tight on time, and so I'm not going to have a dedicated question and answer period because I don't want to drag it out too long. But there will be time after the service, and so hopefully, if you have questions, you can hold them in your mind, and we'll be happy to answer them after the service. We do all of this. It's in our village. We are there with one other missionary family. There's 2 families, and so we're not a large team, and there's a very limited amount of work that we can do. And what we do, we don't do alone. And so we come here to share with you what we're seeing and what God is doing, but also to make you aware of the ways that you can be involved in the work that we're doing. And there are basically, for what I have to share with you today, there's basically 3 ways that we depend on people back in the States to get involved. The first thing and most important thing is we want you to be praying with us. If you're a QR code person, this QR code will take you to the sign-up page for our email newsletter that we send out periodically, and that's the best way to stay up to date on what the prayer needs are for our ministry and for the people that we work with. If you're not into QR codes, that's okay. There's a table out there in the foyer that has some literature and some pictures and some other information, some handcrafts that are made locally in our community that you want to check out. But there's a sign-up sheet back there as well. If you're a pen and paper type of person, you can write your email down there and we can get you added to that list. Another way that's really important for us, as much as anything, to maintain a connection with you, but if you want to really understand better what goes on, then you come and visit us. We need people. That's another. Some of you will recognize a couple of those faces. That was the team from Crosspoint that came down last year. Did a lot of work. We had a week's worth of work lined up for them, and we got all the way through it, and then had to add some more stuff on the end of it. So they were incredible. But we need people. We need short-term teams. We need long-term permanent staff. We need people in between. We need people who want to people maybe who are retired or early retired and want to snowbird and want something more meaningful than Florida. Come and visit us in Honduras. We know some people who do that. They spend their winter months in Honduras and go back and forth. There are all kinds of ways that whatever the time scale is that you're interested in and you're available. I will say real briefly, the position that I am praying most to fill is a long-term, permanent or semi-permanent facilities maintenance person. Someone who has some experience in construction and equipment maintenance. We have a bunch of buildings, a couple of trucks, generators, tractor, those kinds of things. And it takes a lot of energy and a lot of effort to manage, to oversee the maintenance on all of that. And that's something we really need help with. So if you know someone who fits that description, who has some experience in that world, we'd be very interested in talking about what that might look like. Of course, aviation people are always, we're an aviation organization, so we always have room to work those people in. Medical people, we do a lot. We're seeing patients every day, and so there's medical work to be done. And any of those positions pretty much can be filled by either short-term or long-term. So if you're interested in that, please let me know. I will say that we have some really good, some exciting things going right now with some work teams coming early next year, January and February. We've got a couple of different churches. Crosspoint is one of them. Sending a bunch of people. We've got a lot of people signed up for January and February, which I'm really excited about. And so I'd like to kind of do that same thing in like April, March, April, May. There's another window of opportunity we have to have some work teams come down. We're wanting to build a learning center there in our village where we can, just a space that we can get people together and teach and do things like the marriage conference and pastoral training and Bible teaching and work with kids, and there's so many opportunities. Right now, we don't really have a space to do that. We don't have a place that we can get people together, and so that's always a little bit of a, and so that's a project we're wanting to work on. We've got some work teams already scheduled for the early part of the year, but there's room for more, and so I would love to see some of your faces come down and join us for a short time in Roos if you're available to do that. And of course, as you're all aware, none of this happens without financial support. That's part of the process of making this ministry work. There are lots of different ways, lots of different programs that you can give to if you're interested in supporting the work that we're doing financially. Our family's personal expenses is one fund by itself. The Honduras Aeromedical Fund is the medical flights. The airplane is very expensive to operate, and all of the medical flights that we do, or the vast majority of the medical flights that we do, are done at no cost to the patient. And so all of that cost is covered by donors. Same thing with the hospital. We see, on average, 150 patients a month, and almost across the board, they're not paying anything for that, for their consult and the medication that they receive. So that's all covered by donations. And then the Learning Center is a project. Those first three are ongoing, monthly expenses. The last one, the Learning Center, is the construction project that we're working on right now to raise up a place that we can dedicate to the Lord and His people and teach people the ways of God. So those are all things that you can give to if you're interested. This link takes you to a page on our blog that with just instructions about how to find that, how to make that happen if you're interested in doing that. A couple of different ways to do that, and I won't detail them. You can go online and find that if you're interested. Okay, so the question is, at the end of this, the question is why? Why does this matter? All this stuff that we're doing, of course, in my half an hour or 40 minutes, I don't have time to really, as I said, to really go into all the details of everything that's happening. It's a very brief summary. So you might think, okay, what's the connection here? Why does this all matter? Why is this really important? You remember in the beginning, I shared with you 3 phrases that we hear that are part of the Mosquito culture that we hear a lot. And I think for us, a big part of what we're trying to do is prove those 3 sayings wrong. We want to show them, by the love of God, that in fact they're not poor. They may not have a lot of money, that's true, but they're not poor because God has given them so much. They have an incredible sense of community, of togetherness, of helping each other. That's something that we could learn from, actually. They've got an absolutely unstoppable work ethic. When they decide to work, when they decide to go do something, they will work circles around any of us. They go out in the hot sun and they just work. They have a very strong sense of loyalty to their family and to their community. There's a lot of things that they have. They've got a lot of natural resources that they can draw on. They've got opportunities. So in many of the ways that really matter, they're not poor. And so it's a lie that we want to try to turn around and show them the truth. More importantly than that, we want them to know that they're not forgotten. When people here get involved, I don't know if anybody here at Grace Point has been involved in our Christmas gift project that we do every year at Christmas, but we gather funds and gifts and get Christmas gifts for all the children in our village. We have a big Christmas party, and it's a lot of fun. And so these kids receive a box full of stuff that somebody packed that they don't even know. And the reason that we do that is to show them that you're not forgotten. There is somebody who cares about you. Maybe your government doesn't take care of you the way it should, but there is somebody who cares about you. Most importantly, we want to show them that they're not forgotten by God. God cares about them. And the message of the gospel illustrates that God cares about them. And of course, then also, when they say, "Que vamos a hacer?" What can we do about it? We want them to know, we want to prove to them that they're not helpless. These are all pictures that I've taken of people praying in different contexts. And the message that we want to leave with our community is, whatever your problem, whatever your difficulty, if you turn to the Lord, you'll find help. That you're not helpless. You're not poor, you're not forgotten, and you're not helpless. And that's the message, and we show that by compassion, ultimately with the purpose of drawing people into a knowledge and relationship with God. Bring them to the Lord. Plant in them the seeds of faith so that they can trust Christ and live a life that glorifies Him. And we're probably not going to change their entire context of living. They'll always live where they live. They'll live in simple houses. They'll be simple farmers, and that's okay. I don't need to change that. But what I want to see is hearts that are changed. I want to see them living in the joy of the Lord. I want to see them living in the glory of the gospel. And that's the purpose. That's the why. And it goes back to the very first slide, Colossians 1:15. Christ is first. Christ is Lord. And we want Christ to be Lord everywhere, including in their community and in their life. And so that's the purpose. That's what drives us. Thank you for your attention. I know I was kind of rushing through some things there, so hopefully I didn't leave you all completely in the dust. Thank you for your attention, and thank you so much for the support that you give to us. As I said before, your friendship is important, your support is important, and it gives us strength and resources to do what we do and to have a front row seat to what God is doing in Eastern Honduras. And we're very privileged to be part of that. So thank you for being part of our community, enabling us to do that.